Everything you ever learned from National Geographic documentaries about human origins rested upon a simple and elegant story. A small-brained upright ape emerged in Africa nearly 2 million years ago, slowly transformed into a more advanced form called ergaster, then spread across Eurasia as a wandering pioneer before eventually giving rise to later human groups. For decades that picture appeared in magazines, classrooms, television specials, museum halls, and glossy illustrations filled with heroic African savanna scenes. It sounded settled. It sounded unified. It sounded like science had already solved the deepest mystery in human history. Yet beneath that polished surface, another reality existed entirely. Researchers argued bitterly about fossils, argued about dates, argued about anatomy, argued about migration routes, and argued about whether the entire direction of early human expansion had been misunderstood from the beginning. The public rarely saw that conflict. Instead, they received a simplified narrative presented almost like doctrine, even though some of the most important fossils in the story refused to cooperate with it. Something strange stands at the center of this forgotten dispute. The oldest widely accepted Asian upright humans already looked astonishingly successful, widespread, and anatomically established at an extremely ancient point in time. In Indonesia, at sites connected with Sangiran and other regions of Java, human populations thrived within humid tropical landscapes filled with rivers, volcanic plains, giant animals, and dense vegetation. In China, the famous fossils connected with Zhoukoudian revealed powerful populations with thick cranial bone, massive brows, and surprisingly advanced adaptation to northern environments. For generations, these Asian populations became trapped inside a strange intellectual prison. They were described as evolutionary side branches, dead ends, primitive holdovers, or stagnant groups isolated from the main current of human advancement. Yet, that conclusion depended entirely upon assuming that Africa had priority in every stage of development. Once that assumption weakens, the picture changes dramatically. Several researchers pointed toward a deeply uncomfortable possibility. What if the Asian populations were not backward at all? What if they represented the center of expansion rather than the edge? What if the populations later called ergaster in Africa actually entered Africa from Eurasia instead of emerging there independently? The reason this question emerged was simple and difficult to ignore. Ergaster appears in Africa with startling abruptness. The skeleton known as Turkana boy already possessed an elongated body, tall stature, efficient walking adaptation, narrow hips, modern limb proportions, and a surprisingly advanced anatomy for such an ancient human. Yet beneath him, the African fossil trail becomes fragmented and uncertain. Researchers struggled for decades to identify a clean local ancestor that gradually transformed into ergaster within East Africa. Instead, the fossils often appeared discontinuous, scattered, or morphologically inconsistent. That problem became even larger once the Asian record expanded. Fossils from Java and China displayed enormous brain size variation, heavy cranial architecture, and long-lasting regional continuity. Some scientists quietly acknowledged that the supposed technological backwardness of Asian populations relied upon the old Mobius line concept, the belief that Eastern populations failed to produce sophisticated hand axes. Yet later work revealed bamboo technology, wooden technology, tropical preservation problems, and ecological differences that shattered the older assumptions. Tropical Asia does not preserve ancient campsites the same way East African dry sediments preserve bone. Dense forests, volcanic activity, acidic soils, and monsoon erosion erase entire chapters of prehistory. Absence of preserved tools never proved absence of intelligence. The old narrative also ignored basic ecological reality. South Asia and Southeast Asia contain some of the richest biological zones on Earth. Gigantic river systems, coastlines filled with shellfish, dense plant resources, warm climates, and enormous animal biomass created landscapes capable of supporting vast populations for immense spans of time. East Africa, by comparison, shifted repeatedly between harsh, dry phases and unstable environmental pressure. If large populations drive innovation through sheer demographic scale, then tropical Eurasia becomes impossible to dismiss as a mere peripheral zone. The demographic heartland argument suddenly shifts eastward. Even more unsettling was the timing. Several ancient Asian populations appear extremely early, while African ergaster emerges already specialized. Some researchers openly suggested that the first true expansion of advanced upright humans occurred through Eurasia, before certain branches returned into Africa. Tim White himself once acknowledged that the Dmanisi discoveries raised heretical possibilities regarding the birthplace of erectus. That statement rarely entered public discussions because it destabilized the comforting simplicity of the established narrative. Yet Dmanisi mattered enormously because the fossils displayed a mixture of primitive and advanced traits in a region outside Africa at a remarkably ancient period. Suddenly, the direction of movement no longer looked obvious. Then the African fossils themselves became more difficult to organize. One skull in particular stood at the center of growing confusion. Bodo cranium from Ethiopia entered scientific literature as a powerful ancestral form usually placed around 600,000 years ago. Massive brow ridges, enormous facial structure, thick cranial vault bone, and an immense brain combined into a fossil that never fit neatly inside modern categories. Some researchers attempted to place Bodo into a newly invented classification called Bodoensis, largely because the older categories no longer function smoothly. Yet another possibility haunted the debate quietly in the background. Bodo looked strangely connected to older Eurasian populations. The comparisons became difficult to dismiss once researchers placed the skull beside Asian material. The cranial architecture, divided brow structure, long low vault, and powerful facial anatomy carried echoes of Java and northern Chinese populations. Even more intriguing was the geological confusion surrounding the fossil itself. Dating within the Middle Awash system became one of the most contested problems in African paleoanthropology. Sediments shifted across broad landscapes shaped by volcanic activity, erosion, lake formation, and river transport. Different teams argued over formation assignments, member placement, and stratigraphic interpretation for decades. Some earlier interpretations placed certain formations in entirely different chronological order from later revisions. The Daka and Herto deposits became central to this controversy. Early interpretations even positioned those layers differently before later work rearranged the chronology. Fossils associated with Bodo and surrounding material suddenly existed within a cloud of uncertainty far larger than the public ever realized. If some of those formations shifted substantially in age, then Bodo itself drifted backward deeper into time. The possibility of an age approaching 800,000 years created an astonishing implication. Bodo would no longer stand comfortably within a late transitional African lineage approaching modern humans. Instead, it would exist alongside powerful Eurasian upright populations already flourishing across Asia. Once that possibility enters the discussion, the entire anatomy changes meaning. Bodo stops appearing as a uniquely African evolutionary stage and begins resembling a branch connected to widespread transcontinental populations stretching from Indonesia through China and into Western Eurasia. The old map of isolated regional development collapses. Instead, a vast network of moving populations emerges across the Old World. Then another problem appears, one even more difficult to contain. The fossils from Daka and Herto do not fit neatly into the polished evolutionary ladder promoted for decades in popular media. Daka skull possesses traits often described as advanced. Yet many of those traits also appear among earlier Eurasian groups. The skull displays strong brow differentiation, thick cranial structure, long cranial shape, and a combination of features that drift between classic erectus anatomy and later pre-sapiens populations. Some researchers linked Daka with erectus. Others saw affinities with heidelbergensis. Others argued for broader transitional placement. The uncertainty itself became revealing. The geological context surrounding Daka added further tension. Questions emerged concerning volcanic dating, stratigraphic assignment, and whether the fossil truly belonged exactly where later reconstructions placed it. Scratch marks upon the skull triggered arguments regarding carnivore activity, transport, and taphonomy. Some researchers noted the complicated erosional environment of the region, where gullies, washes, and fluctuating landscapes repeatedly moved material across the basin. The idea of a perfectly stable, undisturbed context became increasingly difficult to defend absolutely. Yet the anatomy remained the most intriguing part. Daka carried a strange familiarity to several populations spread across Eurasia. The differentiated brow ridges echoed certain Chinese material. The cranial proportions resembled long-established Eurasian forms more than simplified textbook images of a direct modern human ancestor. Even the immense brain size challenged assumptions. Rather than a smooth, gradual trend toward modernity, Daka looked like part of a broad experiment unfolding across multiple connected regions. Then came Herto. When the Herto fossils appeared, they received enormous publicity as some of the earliest near-modern humans. Magazine covers, television specials, and museum displays promoted the finds as dramatic confirmation of the established African narrative. Yet the actual fossils told a far more complicated story. The skulls possessed huge cranial size, elongated vaults, robust facial structure, strong brow development, and unusual proportions unlike recent human populations. Some morphometric studies even placed Herto outside normal recent human variation in certain measurements. The fossils looked powerful, archaic, and transitional. Researchers attempted to classify the population as an early form of Homo sapiens, yet the designation immediately generated dispute. Some scientists questioned whether the fossils truly fit modern human anatomy. Others emphasized the heavy archaic structure. Still others pointed toward similarities with much older populations from Europe and Asia. Once comparisons expanded beyond the narrow framework of recent African ancestry, startling parallels emerged. Herto shared certain broad characteristics with populations connected to Cima de los Huesos, with Arago Cave, with Soprano, and even with aspects of northern Chinese material linked to Peking man. Suddenly, the neat separation between African modern humans and Eurasian archaic groups became difficult to maintain. Instead, the fossils suggested a massive interconnected population system stretching across continents over hundreds of thousands of years. The labels began failing because the populations themselves refused to obey them. Soprano became especially fascinating within this larger picture. Discovered in Italy, the skull displayed a bizarre combination of traits that seemed to bridge multiple worlds simultaneously. Long, low cranial form, archaic robustness, and transitional features placed it awkwardly between classical erectus populations and later European forms. Some researchers argued endlessly over its classification because none of the existing categories worked comfortably. Yet once viewed as part of a giant interconnected Afro-Eurasian population network, Soprano suddenly made more sense. It resembled a node within a broad continuum rather than an isolated species. Arago created similar problems. The fossils from southern France displayed extraordinary robustness and archaic structure while simultaneously carrying traits connected with later European populations. Cima de los Huesos pushed the mystery even further. Deep within the cave system of Spain, dozens of individuals carried anatomy tied strongly to later Neanderthals, while also retaining older, widespread features. Genetic work from Cima produced additional shock waves because the ancient mitochondrial signals created unexpected connections outside simplistic regional divisions. Then there was Peking man. For generations, the Chinese fossils became portrayed almost like evolutionary prisoners, stranded upon a side branch destined for extinction. Yet the anatomy never fully cooperated with that interpretation. The divided brows, cranial organization, powerful chewing apparatus, and persistence through enormous stretches of time pointed toward a successful, deeply rooted population. Once broader Eurasian interaction enters the picture, Peking man stops appearing isolated. Instead, the fossils become part of a widespread northern network connected through movement, adaptation, and long-term continuity. The public rarely encountered these debates because popular science institutions favored clarity over complexity. Clean diagrams sell magazines. Straight evolutionary arrows fit comfortably into museum halls. Schoolbooks require simplified narratives, yet the actual fossil trail looks more like overlapping waves moving repeatedly across Africa and Eurasia in both directions over immense periods of time. Populations separated, merged, expanded, vanished, and reappeared. Anatomy spread across continents through migration and interbreeding rather than simple replacement. Even the terminology became unstable. Heidelbergensis, Bodoensis, erectus, ergaster, archaic sapiens, pre-Neanderthal, transitional human. The endless labels revealed the deeper problem. Researchers struggled desperately to force fluid populations into rigid boxes. Every new fossil threatened to collapse the categories again. Some fossils looked too advanced for their age, others looked too archaic for their supposed position. Some populations carried combinations never expected under the standard sequence. Turkana boy remained one of the most unsettling examples. The skeleton already possessed remarkably efficient body design, tall stature, and advanced locomotion at an ancient date, yet the earlier African trail behind him looked fragmented. If ergaster truly evolved entirely within Africa, where was the gradual local sequence leading toward that anatomy? Why did the fully established body plan appear so abruptly? Why did Asian populations already display such broad success and diversity? Why did certain African fossils carry such strong Eurasian echoes? The deeper researchers looked, the less stable the old certainty became. Ancient coastlines connected populations during periods of lowered sea levels. Green corridors crossed regions now buried beneath desert. River systems linked enormous territories. Human groups moved farther and earlier than older models allowed. Genetic evidence later revealed repeated interbreeding events among different populations, once believed completely separate. The older image of clean, isolated species lines dissolved almost entirely. Even the emotional tone surrounding these debates became revealing. Certain possibilities were treated almost like heresy. Suggestions that important human developments occurred outside Africa often triggered intense reaction, not merely scientific disagreement. Yet science advances through confrontation with difficult evidence rather than preservation of comfortable stories. The problem was never that Africa lacked importance. Africa clearly played a massive central role in human evolution. The deeper issue involved exclusivity. The old narrative transformed one region into the sole engine of advancement, while reducing Eurasia into little more than a peripheral stage occupied by temporary wanderers. The fossils themselves tell a more tangled story. Java populations persisted for immense spans of time. Chinese populations displayed regional continuity. European populations evolved through complex local patterns tied to wider networks. African populations carried anatomical signals linked outward across continents. The borders between groups blur repeatedly. Daka and Herto perhaps reveal this complexity more clearly than any other African finds. Rather than representing a clean linear progression towards modern humans, they appear like surviving branches from an enormous interconnected Middle World population spread across Africa and Eurasia before the final emergence of recent humans and classic Neanderthals. Their anatomy feels transitional because the entire world during that period was transitional. That possibility changes everything. Instead of imagining isolated species marching upward through a ladder of progress, humanity begins resembling a vast braided river system. Populations diverged regionally, yet remained connected through occasional migration, interbreeding, ecological pressure, and repeated expansion. Traits flowed across enormous distances. One region influenced another continuously. Evolution stopped looking like a tree and started resembling weather patterns crossing continents. Perhaps that explains why so many fossils resist clean classification. Perhaps the categories themselves were always artificial. Soprano, Arago, Sema, Daka, Herto, Peking man, Java man. These populations occupy overlapping territory within a gigantic shifting human network stretching across hundreds of thousands of years. Some branches drifted toward Neanderthals, others drifted toward later humans, some vanished entirely. Yet all of them belong to a broader story far more interconnected than the public ever learned. The real mystery is not why disagreement exists. The real mystery is why the disagreement remained hidden so successfully from ordinary people for so long. Entire generations grew up believing there existed a complete consensus regarding the direction of human evolution when in reality the field remained filled with unresolved arguments, competing interpretations, uncertain dates, and fossils that refused to behave properly. The textbooks appeared certain long before the science actually became certain, and perhaps that remains the most important lesson hidden within these ancient skulls scattered across Ethiopia, China, Java, Spain, France, and Italy. Human origins never followed a simple straight path from one isolated homeland outward toward the rest of the world. The evidence points toward movement, collision, survival, adaptation, and repeated connection across enormous landscapes over immense stretches of time. The deeper the fossil trail grows, the less convincing the old simplified diagrams become. What emerges instead is something larger, older, and far more difficult to control. A human story spread across continents long before the modern world existed, populations entering Africa as well as departing from it, ancient humans crossing tropical Asia, while Europe filled with powerful pre-Neanderthal groups, fossils appearing in unexpected places carrying combinations nobody anticipated, dates shifting, classifications collapsing, old assumptions dissolving under the weight of new discoveries. And somewhere beneath all of it remains a quiet, unsettling possibility. The story told for generations never represented settled truth at all. It represented one interpretation among many, elevated through repetition, until it hardened into public certainty. Yet the fossils never stopped whispering another story entirely. Thank you for watching. If this journey through the ancient human past changed the way you think about human origins, ancient migrations, and the forgotten debates hidden beneath the polished surface of popular science, stay with this channel because there is far more beneath the surface than most people realize. The deeper researchers dig into the ancient ground of Africa, Asia, and Europe, the stranger the story becomes, and the ancient skulls scattered across the old world still refuse to fit neatly into the boxes built around them.